Yu-Gi-Oh! Has two different formats, TCG and the OCG. The former being what we play here in the West, while the latter, the original card game, is how they played in Asia. There are many differences between the two, and in this video we'll be going over what really sets them apart in the eyes of most people, their vastly different ban lists. And starting off at number 10, we have the way the list handled burn. One of the things that stands out the most when going over the OCG list is how many crappy looking monsters are on the forbidden section. We have not only Cannon Soldier, but also its upgraded variant, its tuned variant, and side grades like Amazonas Archer. These all have really similar effects. They all let you tribute monsters to inflict burn to your opponent, and they all lack a once per turn restriction. The thing is that these monsters aren't really playable on their own. So if they're ever used, it's because there's a way to spam the board with enough materials to use them for a first turn kill. The TCG only really has a single card in this category, Mass Driver. Also banned in the OCG, of course. This continuous spell is just Cannon Soldier without the legs, letting you tribute monsters to deal 400 damage to your opponent for each. This was the first time having this kind of effect around was really problematic. And though it could be argued Substitute was the real issue here, it didn't stop them from addressing Mass Driver anyway. While cards like Cannon Soldier already existed back in the day, it's much easier to activate a spell from your hand than to try to put a monster on the field, which would take your normal summon or some other way of cheating it out. Drawing into it wasn't really a problem either, since between Poison Draw Frog and Array of Greed, Frog decks could easily power through their deck, especially once Sub had emptied out all the bricks from the main. Funnily enough, it'd be pretty much the opposite case nowadays, as there's so many ways to get to monsters, it's much more reliable to make your FTK based on one than an unsearchable continuous spell that you have to draw. Still, does that make the OCG's bans justified? Well, somewhat. No one likes going up against FTK decks for very obvious reasons, so no one's going to complain about the hits. Still, it's not like the TCG is an FTK bonanza because we let Cannon Soldier be legal. The last time we kind of had one like this around was when Telephon first came out, as having two in rotation plus a Cannon Soldier is a lethal combo, since it can bring other copies of itself back endlessly. That said, while you could play that deck, these combos are rarely, if ever, relevant at the top level. If you can bring out that much material for a tribute-based card to kill your opponent, odds are you could just build an unbreakable board instead. That wins games just as much, if not more, since a multi-faced board would also give you a much better compromise if you were stopped halfway through, unlike an FTK, which isn't going to leave behind many interactions. The thing that probably tips the scales is how OCG has Maxx, and an FTK is actually a somewhat good compromise into that. They can have all the cards they want in hand if their life points end up hitting 0 after all. This is probably another reason why the OCG chooses to keep these cards chained. Not too long ago, they hit Superheavy Samurai Soulbreaker due to an associated FTK. The same thing happened to Catapult Turtle, used back then to FTK with Magical Scientists, was now being used in line where you would search it with 7th Tachyon, then use it to tribute a huge Numeron Dragon for game. Still, while these cards might look a little bit out of place being banned, it's not really one of the major reasons why the formats are so different. In the end, it's just a small quality of life assurance for something that would only happen once every 100 games, so it doesn't rank very highly on this list. And at number 9, we have how each list handed Toadally awesome, as well as some other similar situations. It is a deceptively powerful monster, and very clearly one of the strongest endboard pieces Konami has ever printed. Its effect not only lets you negate an opponent's card, it also sets it to your field, giving you another free body or spell while denying any graveyard synergies your opponent might have had. If that wasn't enough, it also guarantees you follow-up since it gets you back another water to hand once it hits the grave. The OCG began having a real problem with Toad during the Sprite format, where playing a small frog engine of Swap and Ronin was a very easy way to end on it. Gigantic and Elf let you tutor and reborn any level 2 respectively, easily getting you 2 frogs out to fulfill Toad's summoning requirements of 2 aquas. Now, Sprite was a much bigger problem for them than for the TCG, as the deck actually hit tier 0 status before tier had its big break. One of the most toxic things they could do there was use Gigantic to summon Maxx and then use Swap Frog to bounce it back to hand. Even up until recently, they had both Blue and Jet still limited on their list due to this. It was at this time that they had decided that Toad had been a problem for long enough and banned the card. While we also had Sprite and ours also made Toad, our way to try and stop the card from being too strong was different for sure. Instead of hitting Toad, the TCG put Ronin Toad on the ban list. That did make it more awkward for Sprite to make Toad, and so it wasn't guaranteed to be in every sprite list anymore. But it was still possible to make Toad if you really wanted to. It was just that bit harder to set up. This change actually led to some cool innovations too, since that led to some lists running Bujinki Ashihima or a Melfi package to end on an Arc Light for the negate instead. Still, keeping Toad around certainly had its fair share of negatives. Tier often ran it because they could bring it out by using Bahamut Shark, but of course it looked tame compared to other things Tier was doing at the time. Still, people got fed up with this rank too once Mermail got its latest wave of support. As a deck that easily sets up hand rips or special summon locks, being able to protect either from hand traps through Toad felt a tad too frustrating. Still, once again, this would lead to another card getting punished by Toadally Sin, as Bahamut Shark ate the bullet instead of it. This is just one of the situations where both sides disagrees on what was the problem card though, and it led to quite a few interesting developments, for better or for worse. Another case where this happened was windups, where TCG chose to keep their main starter and extender banned, while the OCG hit their hand rip enabler instead. This let them have windup still around as a somewhat functional deck with their Link era support. The most recent one might be how this list ended up addressing the Fiendsmith question. The TCG first hit Lacrima, which weakened the engine a bit and got rid of their Time win con, and then later got Moonban. The latter was the card which makes any two monsters result in full Fiendsmith combo, not unlike Nightmare Mermaid did for Orcus. The OCG meanwhile was content with just hitting Engraver and Track to 1, which still lets you splash the engine, but makes you way less likely to ever draw into it, as well as making it more fragile versus grave disruption. Both approaches did succeed in making the engine less ubiquitous, but through different means. And at number 8, we have less hatred for limited staples there. The OCG is generally much more lenient with letting cards be allowed at a single copy, even if they become sacky because of it. The biggest example of this nowadays just has to be Heavy Storm and Red Reboot. Heavy was once one of the most feared staples in Yu-Gi-Oh! It was ran in every single deck back when it was legal, and you'd often play around it by setting as few back row as you could get away with. That said, Yu-Gi-Oh! Sure has changed through the years, and that's not really an experience you'll be having anymore. The game is way too fast to worry about having traps for several turns in advance now. If you have 3 back row, you're probably setting all of them. This makes Heavy Storm actually better than it used to be, since it's almost guaranteed to be a 2-for-1. But in practice, it's not really different from the already legal Harpy's Feather Duster or even Lightning Storm. Sure, there's the added benefit of destroying your own cards, and being able to get some extra value for spells that have effects when destroyed, like a case of K9. But that's kind of niche. So the OCG having Heavy off the ban list actually doesn't make that much of a difference, as it's just a side grade for other cards that are already around. If anything, the worst part is now that you can run 5 copies of back row clearing on your side deck, but generally you don't need to respect trap decks that much. That said, Red Reboot is certainly much more egregious. There is counterplay to getting your back row blown up. You can play Lingering Traps, have protection, or reset your back row later, but none of that works versus Reboot. As a spell speed 3 hand trap that negates a trap and prevents your opponent from activating more of them on the same turn, this is almost always a 1 card I win the game versus decks like Lab and Eldritch. However, the OCG still allows it around as just a 1-of, while the TCG got fed up with this sort of gameplay and banned it several years ago. That is all to say, the impact these singletons can have around is really unpredictable. You can only say if it's good or bad for the game on a card-by-card basis. The TCG actually recently got 2 such staples back to 1 after many people had completely given up on them, those being Grass and Brilliant Fusion. 2 cards that once ravaged the meta, but are pretty inoffensive at 1 since for most decks, they do impose huge deck building requirements, as Grass asks you to play a higher deck count, while Brilliant requires bricks in your main. They're by no means bad, but you need to be playing a really specific deck to make them good. With these recent changes to the ban lists, it definitely feels like there's a trend that's starting to die down, especially if you look at the current lineup of limited continuous traps in the game. Still, you can't help but wonder if we would have just been better off with all these cards banned, as sacky one-offs like IO and Vanity have ruined plenty of games in the past up until finally getting removed from the legal card pool. And at number 7, we've got how the list handles semi-limits, or cards that you can only have 2 copies of in your deck. This is another one that's definitely been changing over the years, but it used to be one of the biggest differences when looking at the lists. For a long while, the OCG would always have massive semi-limited lists, containing cards from many different archetypes and seemingly disconnected staples, while the TCG had an extremely small one. At many points, we'd have 3 or less cards on our semi-limited list, while the OCG would have over 20, and this was only a couple of years ago. The TCG's nickname for it was actually the Malicious list for a long time, because it was the only card that felt like it had any reason to be there, as its power scales with how many copies you're allowed to run. While sure, you'd sometimes see other staples there in the TCG like Tenki, Nessie, or Toadally, it was pretty much always the case that these cards were just being slowly moved up the list, from limited to semi, and would be put to 3 eventually. We don't usually get ban list explanations from Konami, so we can't really tell why this was, but it wasn't really something the player base contested much. The general sentiment was that semi-limiting a card didn't feel like it did enough, as most cards aren't like Mali, who actually get their power level reduced while on that list. The chance of drawing any given 3 of in a deck of 40 is around 1 in 3. While your odds do get changed to around 1 in 5 if it's bumped down to a 2 of, you're still seeing it basically twice as much as if it was limited. Not only that, but a card being put to 1 can actually hamper the grind game of a lot of decks. Specifically, if you take something like Yugioh, a card its deck would love to be able to activate from the hand both turn 1 when sent to the board and turn 3 on the crackback. This is an angle that's totally lost if the card is at 2. The biggest upside in putting cards to 2 is being able to hit a deck's power level just a tiny bit, while still allowing them to be played the same way as they did before, just slightly less consistent. This was how the OCG preferred to touch decks, at least at first. And so, if you look through the years, you can see a ton of random engine cards like Havness, Fractal, and Curse Eldland in their semi-limited lists, as well as generic annoying staples like Emergency Teleport, Mask Change 2, and Super Polymerization. Still, it seems that at some point this philosophy started to converge, something which the player base actually came to enjoy since it allows powerful decks to be hit sooner without much backlash. We saw a glimpse of this with both Kashtira Unicorn and Sprite Starter being put to 2 back when these decks were still relevant, but it seems to have come into full effect with Malice and Yugioh, who had basically all of their main deck cards put to 2. That said, they seem to have skipped over this page when handling the Justice Hunters deck by putting both Razin and Stake Your Soul directly to 1 recently, so who knows if we'll go back to semi-limited irrelevance soon. And at number 6, we have how generic draw is handled. Historically, it always felt like the TCG was way more strict than they had any right to be with draw cards. The first big point of diversion with this began all the way back in 2016, when the TCG first limited Upstart Goblin. Although the reason at the time was mainly the neuter Monarch FTK, which aimed to draw through its entire deck and kill with Life Equalizer and Magical Explosion, this card had seen a lot of play before. Since Upstart is a free draw 1, the idea was that if you ran 3 in your 40 card list, you were essentially running a 37 card deck, allowing for maximum efficiency. This was a really popular deck building strategy at the time, which got popularized by many pros of the time. Still, going back to the FTK specifically, while we banned Chicken Game and limited Upstart, the OCG chose to ban the traps instead to deal with that issue. And while we did somewhat reverse these changes in the TCG, it wasn't until much later. Upstart spent the better part of the last decade limited, only being brought back to 3 recently, while Chicken Game was also only recently unbanned, but is still at 1. This is without even getting into the other generic draw cards that the TCG seems to have forgotten on the list, such as Into the Void and Sekka's Light. Still, although you would think the consistency would be more king now than ever, the usefulness of these cards has definitely dropped with the years. The opportunity cost of putting generic draw 1s in your deck is simply too big. Not only do you have to have a lot of good cards in your deck to fill with, many of which are going to get you much more than a draw 1, that old math of a 37 card deck simply doesn't work anymore. Imagine you're going second and you have an Upstart in hand. It doesn't matter that your deck is technically smaller, that Upstart is a blank while your opponent combos off. You'd have been much better served if it was an actual hand trap instead. While there are board breaker decks as well as archetypes with spell synergies such as Sky Strikers, there's still a risk when putting 3 Upstarts in your list due to Droll and Lockbird. Since Droll prevents you from adding or drawing cards once it's resolved, it turns all of your Upstarts in the deck into de facto blanks once it's activated. And the last thing you want is to make this already strong hand trap even better. These kinds of issues all apply to some degree for Chicken Game and Into the Void, even if they have some particularities that set them apart. This is not to say that Upstart is a bad card or that it sees 0 play or anything of the sort, just that the card definitely has its pros and cons now instead of being all upsides. And it clearly is a case where the TCG was too stubborn to let it go to 3 for far too long for very little reason. And at number 5, we have the TCG's anti-pendulum bias. This one can almost entirely be summed up to OCG having Electrumite while the TCG does not. If you didn't know, Heavymetalfoes Electrumite is a fire psychic link too, which can be made with any 2 pendulum monsters. If it's link summoned, you can add any pendulum from your deck to your extra deck face up. Once per turn, it lets you target another card you control and destroy it to add a face up pendulum monster from your extra deck to your hand. And lastly, if a card in your pendulum zone leaves the field, you can draw a card. So for those of you who don't know, Electrumite almost single-handedly carried the pendulum mechanic on its back when it was legal. It has 3 amazing effects that let you gain advantage while you set up your pendulum summon. And it kind of lets you get to any pendulum in your deck too. It's completely fair to have this card at 1 like the OCG does, since only its draw effect is a hard once per turn for some reason. But banning it kneecaps pendulum decks far too much. The banning of Electrumite never felt entirely justified in the TCG. It didn't get hit on the list because we had a tier 0 pendulum format with it or anything of the sort. It was just simply another casualty of the massive 2020 ban list that heralded the beginning of Master Rule 5. This was a preventative hit that was meant to stop Pendulum from becoming too good, since that same list tried to kill off all of the toss decks to varying degrees of success. Except that, while some of the other Pendulum hits would be reverted with time, this one never was. It may not sound like a big deal since it's just a single card, but Electrumite being banned all these years really limited how prevalent the mechanic was for the last several years. Take for example, Supreme King and Valence. Both seen as incredibly weak archetypes for us in the TCG, and while they weren't competitive superstars over in Japan, they did get their fair share of tops in the OCG. It's not only that Heavymetalfoes Electrumite is that good, it's that new pendulum archetypes are always designed around it. If all new cards assume you're going to have a copy of it in your extra deck, that means that every single new pendulum archetype is going to be weaker in the TCG by default. Even additional pieces of generic pendulum support like Beyond the Pendulum were made as companions to Electrumite and not replacements. Unfortunately, this doesn't feel like a change the TCG is willing to budge on, as whoever handles the TCG ban list really doesn't like these generic Link 2s being around, while the OCG doesn't mind as long as it's not problematic. This can be seen with Nightmare Goblin, which they recently released, but there's no telling if we'll follow suit anytime soon or not. Either way, this extended vacation for Electrumite, and to a lesser extent Starving Venom, shows how little the TCG is interested in having pens be a driving force in the game ever again, as if their exclusion from Genesis format wasn't enough of a tell. And at number 4, we have the treatment of generic combo lines. The previous spot on this list is somewhat relevant here too, but Western Konami's hate of pendulums definitely felt deserving of its own spot on the list. Either way, there's just a ton of generic combo staples that ended up becoming problematic throughout the years, so we banned them. But the OCG never really had that big of an issue with them. This includes a ton of generic link monsters like Isolde, Curious, and Auroradon, as well as many main deck all-stars like Fairy Tale Snow and Block Dragon. The general trend is that these cards are all associated with all-in combo decks that have plagued the game in one way or another. Isolde was seen as too much once Infernoble got its newest pieces of support. The card gave them a ridiculous push to be able to make unbreakable boards, and would also be shielded from hand traps due to Aqua Dolphin. Curious was specifically problematic in tier at some point due to its ability to foolish for any card in the game, letting you even set up any floodgate you wanted with its fellow, now banned buddy, Nightmare Griffin. But it was also perfect for sending snow too. Auroradon was mostly an issue back when Halki Fibrax was still around, due to its generic materials. But the OCG actually has it still be a formidable piece, since they also have Galaxy Tomahawk. Block Dragon was banned due to being a ridiculous piece in Adamantipator, the first deck to ever abuse Master Rule 5 in its entirety, but it also supports playing something like Gem Knights as a combo deck. While these may all sound like huge cancers to the game, which should have been addressed, and they certainly were for us, these interactions never felt like that big of an issue for the OCG. In fact, all-in combo decks will generally overperform for us in the TCG, but underperform for them in the OCG, and it's definitely not just a playstyle preference thing. The OCG's always had Maxx, which is just a natural deterrent to this issue. When you get hit by the bug, it's best that you have either an out or a compromise. Heavy combo decks usually pack less non-engine slots, and so it can be a bit more painful to slap in anti-hand trap cards without sacrificing consistency, especially in your main deck. They also tend to play less hand traps themselves, so their half boards don't get backed up by much going on in their hand either. To be fair, no one likes playing against these all-in combo decks anyway, so it's not like it's terrible we have all these cards on the ban list. The only issue people have with cards like Curious or Isolde bannings was that they took too long to happen, if anything. It even feels like this trend is extending itself to not only enablers, but also end board pieces, as we've seen the banning of Savage, Barone, and Appaloosa, even if the latter is something the OCG ended up adopting too. Alas, they still have many more toys than us in cards like Invoker, Samorg, and even the recently unbanned Eclipse Wyvern, showing that any big impact these combo enablers have are more than made up for by the existence of a certain hand trap. And at number 3, we have the OCG's hate for cards that do a lot without special summoning. This is a bit specific, but cards that put out a decent interruption while not giving your opponent much at all if they get hit by Maxx tend to get hit extremely quickly by the OCG. This becomes very clear when you look at how both regions handle Dragoon, for example. Red Eyes Dark Dragoon is a huge fusion monster that can't be destroyed or targeted by card effects, can destroy up to 2 of your opponent's monsters without targeting, and burns them for their attack power, all on top of sporting an Omni Negate that increases its attack by 1000 per negate. This card was a huge issue in the OCG when it first came out, because despite its materials being 2 vanillas, it was also extremely easy to bring out. This was due to Red Eyes Fusion, which can just fuse Dragoon using materials from your deck at the cost of locking you out of summons the turn it's used, or Predaplant Averting Anaconda, which was still legal, and lets you dump Red Eyes Fusion for the same effect, but without the restriction. Either way, this card was everywhere in the OCG, with many people running a full playset of Red Eyes Fusion just to get Dragoon out. There was a specially powerful kind of deck that rose around this time called End, Eldritch Numeron Dragoon, where going first you would rely on Dragoon plus Eldritch traps to win, while going second you could just activate the Numeron field spell for an OTK. Either way, there was much to be feared over Dragoon coming out in the TCG, as everyone of course thought it would take over the meta like it did in the OCG. And it did end up seeing a lot of play, but it was nowhere as bad of an issue as it was over there. Putting the 2 bricks into your deck felt really bad, and actually hard drawing Red Eyes Fusion was not something you were looking forward to doing. As a result, we never really had to hit the engine on the ban list, while the OCG had to limit Red Eyes Fusion for a while, until they eventually banned Dragoon for several years. A similar thing happened with Fusion Destiny and DPE, where they had to ban Fusion Destiny while the worst we ever did was semi-limit the thing. Though, at around this time, both lists would go on to hit the real problem card Inverte anyway. Still, there's a few more instances of this happening. The Adventure Engine, for example, was handled a lot differently in both regions. Over there, they hit a lot of the cards like Right and Enchantress to minimize its consistency, until they eventually got done with it and banned Griffin. While in the TCG, the engine was never hit directly, and just fell off naturally to power creep after a couple of years. Lastly, there was the Fenrir situation, also banned in the OCG and completely legal here. Cash-tier cards in general tend to be very good into Maxx. Their inherent summon basically forces opponents to shotgun it during the standby phase, which makes it much easier to play around. Fenrir was overplayed not only in cash, but also generically as a good card, and was whittled down list by list until it finally got banned. Even at 1 copy, people would still play Fenrir in unrelated decks without a search target, just so that it could be a Pankratops-like card that compromised well under hand traps. While we still have Fenrir at 3 in the TCG, and it's not really a problem. It does see play, but it's only arguably gotten worse with time due to Mulcharmy punishing it so nicely. Either way, these kinds of engines will always end up being more powerful over there than they are here, since your deck has to be at least somewhat good into a resolved Maxx to succeed. And at number 2, we have the way engines are hit. One of the most important parts about any given ban list is how hard it hits the current best deck. And the OCG and TCG approaches are just vastly different. In the TCG, usually we avoid hitting engines of decks directly, up until at least a few months of it being legal, and so only adjacent cards end up getting touched until eventually we kill the deck completely. While in the OCG, they prefer the death by 1,000 cuts approach for engines. There's tons of examples of this, so let's go over some. Take Superheavy Samurai, for example. The deck went from a joke to one of the scariest combo decks overnight with the release of its new support, being able to end on an Apo Baron Regulus and more off of a single card, all while beating most hand traps and generating infinite follow-up. The deck was promptly killed off in the TCG, where we just banned their Link 1, while it was still allowed to exist in the OCG as they just limited Soulpiercer and Semied Motorbike. Same could be said for Mathmech, where we banned Circular while they just limited it, though the TCG did eventually bring it back. Then there's also Snake Eyes, where both lists did agree a bit with each other by limiting both Ash and Poplar at some point. The finishing touches were vastly different though. While the TCG chose to ban Original Sinful Spoil and kill the engine at last, even if it took far longer than it should have, the OCG still has it around, albeit with both Witch and Wanted also limited. This philosophy of theirs ties well with something we have previously talked about, in that generic endboard pieces and combo enablers are more free. The OCG is fine with letting you do more disgusting combos, as long as they're much less consistent and fragile. Like, technically, over there, you can still be hit by a Rise Heart plus Mind Hacker, just good luck seeing it happen when Fenrir, Unicorn, and the Field Spell are all on the Forbidden Limited list. Overall, this approach does end up meaning that the TCG gets rid of generic cards that might be annoying in the future more than our Eastern counterparts, which isn't that bad per se. You don't really need to worry about new Cyber stacks abusing Splash Mage, Winged Beast stacks making use of Submorg, Synchro decks using Barone, but on the flip side, there's an issue just like Electrumites, in that decks might actually be designed around these cards and thus be too weak instead. It can also be really annoying how reluctant the TCG can be to free these kinds of cards too. Like, we took that much longer to free Trident from the list in a world where Detonator existed. They still let cards like Natura's Sacred Tree and Astrograph Sorcerer languish in the limited list up until this day. Granted, the OCG has some cards they just forgot about on the list as well, but we seem to have many more. While they might still be afraid of, say, Trickstar Reincarnation, there is no reason why we ought to have Final Countdown, Change Strike, Divine Wind to Mist Valley, or even Monster Gate being limited for so long. Either way, these are really some of the things that make TCG and OCG feel as different as they are. Though the next thing we're talking about is even more important. And finally, at number 1, we have, of course, Maxx. It was pretty obvious this one was coming, and plenty of things said earlier in this list alluded to it as well. If you've somehow made it this far without knowing, Maxx is a hand trap that can be activated as a quick effect during either player's turn, letting you discard it to apply a lingering effect to your opponent, where each time they special summon that turn, you draw a card. This is hands down the strongest hand trap the game's ever seen, and is maybe the strongest card legal in either format. The impact Maxx has being around really can't be understated, and we talked about it at many points earlier in this list, talking about how it makes decks good or worse and even dictates what gets banned or not to a certain extent. Having Maxx around illegal is the reason why they have cards like Called by the Grave at 2, as it is both an out to Maxx and a way to make sure it resolves past an Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. It's also the reason why they had Crossout Designator become toxic so much earlier in the OCG while it wasn't that good in the TCG for quite a while. When your opponent is almost guaranteed to also have Maxx, Ash, and Called by in their list, your Crossout is pretty much always going to have value. This creates a very real deck building tax on top of everything, as you feel like you need to include in every deck the max copies of Maxx, Ash, Called by, and Crossout. This was a 9-card package out of your 40 for a really long while, and though it's been reduced to 8 now that the semi-limited Maxx, the dynamic remains the same. This also creates a pregame of sorts, where you need to see if your Maxx will go through their outs before you actually interact with real hand traps in a meaningful manner. Maxx being legal also hugely boosts how good certain archetypes are, depending on how they play around or against it. As we've mentioned before, cash cards as well as sprites and yummies all have inherent summoning conditions, and thus are even better in the OCG than here. With Sprite specifically, one of the reasons the deck reached Tier 0 status was that since Maxx is level 2, it's a monster you can bring out with Gigantic or Elf, and then get it into your hand with a Swap Frog. Dracotail has a similar interaction with our Arthalion, which it can fetch back any monster from the graveyard, leading to them limiting Ketu Dracotail on their latest list. The recently released Mulcharmy cycle of hand traps actually gave the TCG a taste of what this kind of gameplay is like, but due to each of them only taxing special summons from certain places, as well as basically only being usable during your opponent's turn, makes it more realistic to play around them without having to direct out. Though in the case of the OCG, it might have just made the problem worse, as you can now get turn skips by both Maxx and the Charmies that match your deck. Still, at least they don't contribute to the awful gameplay pattern that is whenever a deck goes first versus you, beats your Maxx C if you have it, ends on full combo, and then also Maxx Cs you on your turn. Something which unfortunately happens a lot both in the OCG and Master Duel. People were half hoping that the OCG would finally address Maxx C with the Charmies being released, and it was even semi-limited. But now, a few lists later, it hasn't really budged from there, making that hit seem like the time they put Ash to 2 randomly and not a sign of what's to come. Maxx C is a fixture of the OCG format, while it is only something we fear coming back in the TCG, and it does feel like the main reason why both formats are almost different games. Be it as it may, you can't think about the OCG without thinking about Maxx C, and that's the reason why it just had to be the most important card on this list.